You know, this channel is called Whitetail Habitat Solutions. It's interesting, 75–80% of the views and the traction come from whitetail strategy. That's my biggest area. All the habitat improvements and information comes from whitetail strategies. That was the foundation of my roots, is how to hunt, hunting on public land, private land, doing that in multiple states for decades, and then starting a channel, starting a business to try to teach people how to match their habitat improvements and their goals to how you should actually hunt the land, because most information out there on how to build your property, what you can do on your property, how to improve the habitat, does not relate to how you should hunt the property, and therefore it's a failure. So because a lot of times you're building improvements that actually hurt your ability to get on and off the property without spooking deer, to hunt like a predator. I remember back in the day, some of the habitat management people just talking about, we need to improve every square inch of the property. You know, if this is a wetland, this should be something to do with water over here. There's a good spot for native grass. This is a good spot for timber management, TSI. They're plugging all these pieces that they learn in school onto the land, but they don't relate for hunting. You actually come out with a poor hunting property. And a lot of those things, because they're taught in a classroom and they're not really related to in the field, then you're not actually producing a better wildlife property, let alone whitetail property. So when it comes to transitioning from our hunting strategy talk, you know, we lose viewers because there's viewers that are here purely for hunting, and that's the majority of our subscribers' views. And then we have that solid base of habitat people, and that's what we're doing the rest of the year. And it's interesting, we get into this kind of time, I get excited because we know what we're doing. The first thing we're doing is bedding area on the property. We're working on bedding areas. And so I get excited for that, but it's kind of a letdown on when I'm putting it out on social media, YouTube. We're not getting the same traction that we did in the middle of October, talking about a giant cold front coming through, or the end of October and talking about rut strategies. So we're in that time frame, and I hope you guys like that transition. And we're going to talk about bedding areas. And if you're here, you're hunting public land, we're talking about bedding areas, when to create them. I want you to find, when it comes to bedding areas, what you're trying to do, whether it's on your property or whether you're finding it on public land, is you're trying to duplicate where you're seeing deer bed. And so a lot of times you're not going to find how to build a bedding area in an article, and these are the 7 things you need to do, 7 secrets. Someone out there teaches that. Instead, you have to find, what does a bedding area look like in your area, and then try to duplicate it or find it. That's what you have to do. And so we'll talk about down here what to cut, you know, on your own land. But you're trying to duplicate and match the features that deer need, those ingredients, for a bedding area in the first place. So, you know, those are other videos that we talk about, but I'll talk about the timing of bedding area. I get excited because December and coming up, we'll talk about why is the time to make a bedding area, and there's a lot of reasons why. So let's go through that. We're transitioning from hunting to habitat. I hope you guys are okay with that. And we'll talk about pollinator blends and switchgrass and rabbit homes as we're talking about this. And again, the majority of the views are hunting whitetail views, because that's the majority of people out there for whitetails and looking for hunting advice. But I love this time of year because it all goes back to those roots of how to improve the habitat based on a high level of hunting experience, and how you can actually improve your property for wildlife and hunting, which isn't necessarily what you learn in a classroom. In fact, it's the opposite a lot of times. Wintertime is the best time to improve bedding areas. Maximum regen, meaning you're cutting at a time the habitat is dormant. It means all that energy basically is in the ground or frozen. And once it gets in the spring and sap starts flowing, things are moving outward, you want your cuttings already created so that you get maximum regeneration, explosion of habitat. You want the sun to then hit the floor right off the bat when the soil temperature improves, so that woody browse, brush, briars, grasses, weeds, herbaceous growth can actually take off. Sunlight's hitting the ground, warms it up, everything explodes. So you want to cut during the winter and allow that to happen. Number 2, see the woods to plant. When there's no leaves on the ground, you're not worrying about bugs, heat, sweat. You can actually see the lay of the land. You can imagine out here in these hills, even if you have elevation change of 20 feet, 30 feet, you can see the lay of the land so much better during the wintertime. Let alone if you add a 1/2 inch of snow, 1 inch of snow. Those are perfect times. I love looking at client properties in January, February. We look at properties. My first trip is in December every year. My last trip was in September. I can say some of my most miserable times to walk a property were in August, September, with snakes, chiggers, ticks, bugs, mosquitoes, sweat, sun, sunburn. You know, that's the time that's my least favorite time to look at property, but we look at property I do from December to September. Dylan, your first trip this year is December too, right?
Yep.
Or are you, okay, it is December and then
before Christmas.
Yeah, and that's when I always do mine. So we have those solid clients right then, and then every month after that. Dylan, what's your favorite time to look at? What's your favorite month?
I really like March for some reason. It's not too hot, not too cold usually, and I feel like the sign from the previous fall is just really starting to stick out after it's coming out from being buried by snow for so long.
Yeah, I do northern Michigan. I think it's Gaylord I'll be at this year, and that is, you know, the northern part of Michigan. That's a snow belt. They average about 180 inches of snow, and that's my April trip. But I'm not going to Gaylord in February. There's 40-inch snowpack, and I do go up into those snow belts with snowshoes and walk property, but it's a lot more fun when it's gone and there's no bugs. April's a pretty cool time. But a lot of reasons to cut during the winter time. See the woods to plan, that's one thing. See the trees, widowmakers, so I believe it's safer time to cut. You can see what's in the trees, they're not covered up by leaves. So if you have a vine that's going to swing a trunk around and hit you, or if you have a big dead branch that's going to fall on your head, there's a greater ability to see when the leaves are off the trees. And yeah, especially when you have bugs and sweat, you could add that in there too. And then of course, browse for deer. Deer love those tips. It doesn't matter if those tips of hardwood regeneration are 3 feet off the ground or if they're 60 feet off the ground, you cut them. Those deer love to eat those tender tips, and it's good nutrition for them, and it's a really bountiful amount of food during the winter time. So great time to cut during the winter. Number 2, mature buck reaction. You know, there's a couple different examples I can see of this, but we'll see client properties where they have major timber production, timber harvest taking place, or they have major timber cuttings for bedding areas and wildlife restoration to attract more wildlife and whitetails to their land. And when you do that, and you have a buck that you're after, he's 4 or 5 years old, makes it through the season, he sometimes does not react to those cuttings favorably. You go make those cuttings, let's say you have a timber harvest in June, July, August. Now I've seen the flip side. I've seen where we've made cuttings in September, early September, and then landowner has their best season. But those are those cases where they have big, open, hardwood timber, and they don't have a lot of deer there to begin with. They don't have certain target bucks they're after. And certainly they're going to have a lot more deer on the land when you make those cuttings. But you could have that 4 or 5 year old buck that you're after be a little wary after you make those cuttings. It's the same thing when you're clearing shooting lanes. If I have major shooting lanes to clear or cuttings to clear for a blind or a tree stand, I'd rather do those in March, April, May than certainly June, July, August. I put a lot of stands out in June, July, August, even early September, but they're in those stands where I know I don't need to clear any lanes. I can just throw a tree up, there may be a little bit of rain, wash away the scent, some high wind so the deer can't hear me, and I just put it up, get out of there. No different than a hang and hunt scenario, but I'm doing it 2 or 3 weeks before the season begins. You don't need to do it 6 months before the season's again, but if I have major cutting taking place, I want to do that months before the season begins so the deer in the area have a chance to get used to it. And I believe too, you see these big branches that are down or trees with a bunch of dead leaves on them. I think they'll stick out to deer, to bucks. You know, why is this tree? It's a fresh cut. It's a fresh blowdown, whatever it is to them, but I think they have an aversion to it, especially when it's the only one in the woods. People think, well, windstorms come through, tornadoes, a straight line wind knocks trees down, but that's over a larger area typically, not just in a shooting lane by a tree stand. So bucks get used to it over a large scale within the neighborhood or within a larger area other than just one spot in front of your stand. So mature buck reaction, something you have to consider. Sheds. You know, if I'm cutting right now, and if I'm cutting in February, March, that's at a time when bucks in the area are leaving their sheds. If I want to find a lot of sheds and I have the food for them that they're hitting, then if I'm out here cutting in February, March, not to say I wouldn't, but if I do care about sheds and finding them, it might not be the best time to cut, because when you're out in the woods and you're cutting repeatedly, now those deer might come in at night, they might stay off the property and come in, but you can push them away. Now, if I'm going out there and cutting for a weekend, then I can see them coming back. But bottom line is, I like cutting, and we'll talk about what to cut for a second here, but I like cutting as soon as the season ends. You know, right now that'd be early January, whether it's in Wisconsin or Minnesota. To me, that's a great time. It meets all the criteria right here for getting the maximum regeneration, adding browse for deer, avoids a negative mature buck reaction for the next year, helps me find sheds. It's not a time sheds are dropping. Actually helps then because you have these tops sitting there. And then exactly, when I cut right at the season ends, then it's a perfect time. I get maximum regeneration. Deer are none the wiser when it becomes hunting season. I can see, cut safely. So really good time to cut. And when I'm cutting, what do you cut? How do you make a bedding area? Well, if you put in how to make a bedding area, what to cut for timber for bedding area, you can find my videos all up. We have bedding area, a bedding area category in our playlist. Anything you're looking for that relates to whitetail strategy management, cuttings, trail cameras, mock scrapes, whatever it might be, you can look up these categories in my playlist. But bottom line is that your woods can be completely different than another person's woods. Hinge cuts, for example. Hinge cuts are a viable tool in any competent whitetail manager's toolbox for creating bedding area. We might recommend that in 15% of our lands, 10% Dylan, 20% at the most. And that doesn't mean we go on a client trip for 10. We might have 1 or 2 that we recommend hinge cuts on, maybe 3. Timber harvest, that's not appropriate for every property. There's people sitting that are enrolling in a managed forest law within the state of Wisconsin, and they're not going to have any timber cuttings for 25 years because the state of their forest is such. So that's not a viable option for a lot of people. You don't want to wait 25 years to do something. There's always something you can do. Bottom line is, like here, we have large mixed habitat, mixed diversity, mature timber. Whether that's aspen or oak is a large portion. We have box elder areas. So for me, I don't want to cut my straight big oaks down. They're my timber value trees, but I want them. They typically, those biggest oaks that are the most desirable for timber value also have the biggest canopy and drop the most mass crop of acorns. So I don't want to cut those down. So I'm cutting leaning oak, but I'm especially focusing on those aspen pockets that are typically ½ acre in size on my land anyways, or less. Some are 2 acres, but I have little pockets here and there. I also have little pockets of box elder, especially closer to the field edges, or that in part of that early successional growth. So I like cutting out those pockets. When it gets into the interior of the woods and I have more largely oak or hardwood, cherry, then I'm looking for big undesirables, multi-trunked leaners, oaks that don't have a big mass production top and they're poor timber value because they're crooked or leaning, forked, damaged. And so I'm looking to drop down a good size hardwood tree to let some sunlight in and put structure on the ground in an otherwise open setting every 50, 60, 70 yards. So imagine a big tree laying down in the ground every 60, 70 yards. So then you're cherry picking. You're looking at the biggest, easiest to drop. When you get into some difficult cuttings or woods to cut, or those medium age, say maple or aspen, where they're great trees to cut for regeneration and wildlife value, but they're all in that pole timber size of 4 to 8 inches, 10 inches. Then you have to really cut a lot and push trees down between trees. You end up getting tangled up, and you're almost better getting a forestry mulcher in there. Picture a bobcat with a big head on the front, almost like a curling iron, where it grinds those trees down. And you don't want to grind into the root system in the soil because that destroys the regeneration value. But you're grinding those down, chipping them up almost. You can use some of the big rotary cutters, like a giant heavy-duty brush hog on the front of a bobcat, and grind those down if they're smaller diameter. The bottom line is then you're getting regeneration in pockets. You're creating those pockets just kind of like that big heavy timber tree that you're dropping every 50, 60, 70 yards. You're doing that same with pockets. You're grinding down the cover so you get sunlight in there, regeneration, and then you go 50, 60 yards, do it again. 50, 60 yards, do it again. You have a blend of all types in between. There's areas where you have mixed age timber coming in, and then you're focusing on those soft maple, sometimes cherry, but more maple, box elder, even aspen you're completely cutting down. And then box elder, soft maple, you're hinge cutting. Hickory you can hinge cut. But you're hinge cutting depending on the species of the tree, and you're doing it in that 3 to 6 inch diameter range, and you're doing that in pockets. A lot of times I like creating pockets that deer can actually move through. You're not making canopies over the top. That's, kind of more of a ridiculous form of bedding area where deer can supposedly lay under this canopy, but if they can see out the sides 150 yards, that's not a good thing either. And most of the time those canopies collapse and they're waste, and then if you have big timber around them, they're shaded so they don't grow and they die out and they dry out. So look at how to cut in some of our other areas, but for the best time, it really pays to get out there right when the season begins. There's a lot of people online right now that are super excited about getting out and starting with their habitat improvements right when the season ends so they can prepare for next season. That's why we came out with a monthly deer chores. There's always something to do, and you can bet when it comes to the first part of January, after our season's done, in January, first part of January, right after the season's done, we're going to be out cutting timber for bedding areas. We have areas I can't wait to do that in. And that's also the time a lot of times we really start focusing on some of our rabbit houses adjacent to our switchgrass, making cuttings for wildlife, rabbits, pheasants, turkey nesting. That's all in that edge habitat next to our big switchgrass fields and pollinator blends. And then that sets the table for whitetail bedding right on the edge of that down into our interior of the woods. So we'll talk about all that. We'll show all that as we're cutting it going in. Make sure you don't miss the best time to be out in the woods, creating bedding areas safely based on your skill level with a chainsaw or having someone else do it, hiring someone else. We can help you with that. But not us doing it, but we'll point you in the right direction at least. But a great time to get out very soon, right after the season begins, and it'll pay big dividends for next year when you're sitting there wondering what you could have done different. That's one of the first steps to improve your habitat. So many more steps. You have to have quality food on your property. That's food plots when it comes to private land. And again, public land, you're looking for high stem count cover, diversity of cover, change in elevation, change in age of timber and type of timber. And that's where you find great bedding. And what you're trying to do on private land is create just that. There's nothing secret, nothing special about it. Deer need to move throughout it. You need good regeneration of weeds, briars, bushes, hardwood. And if you get those to happen in a spot and you leave it alone, and it relates to quality food, meaning it's supported by quality food, then you're going to create great bedding on your property, and it all starts a lot sooner than you might think. I urge everyone out there to really check out my web classes. They've been wildly successful. We have one that details how you should design your land, another one that details how you should plant and maintain and manage a food plot program. How can you make those decisions that fit your land specifically and not someone else's? Unfortunately, there's so much information in the hunting industry that says you should do this, but it doesn't apply to you. These web classes directly apply to you. And then we have our third web class that came out last year, our rut web class, navigating the entire rut. And then we have our fourth one coming out, which is hunting hills and thermals. I urge you to check those out, try the web classes, and they're all about teaching, helping you understand how you can navigate, not only managing your property, food plots, and the rut, but also hunting strategically, hills, thermals, and wherever you pursue whitetails for your dream and your passion.